happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land. Here age relives fond memories of the past, and here youth may savor the challenge and promise of the future. Disneyland is dedicated to the ideals, the dreams, and the hard facts that have created America, with the hope that it will be a source of joy and inspiration to all the world.
Since the dawn of time, we have looked up to the night sky, fascinated and bewildered by the notion of outer space. Guided by our natural urge to explore, great minds across history have mapped out distant stars and planets, while postulating otherworldly realms in the far apogees of the universe. One such great mind who had his eyes fixed upon the stars was Walt Disney. In a dynamic era dominated by space exploration and science fiction stories, Walt Disney, a man obsessed with weaving storytelling and innovation together, took that notion of exploring the final frontier of outer space and brought it to life within his sandbox of imagination. His fruits of labor eventually led to the conception of a series of exciting space-age attractions that blended the line between reality and fantasy, and in one such incredible instance, allow thrill-seekers of all ages to conquer the unknown perils of galaxies beyond. Prepare to duck your heads as we dive into the cosmic story of one of Disney's most famous theme park attractions, Space Mountain. The idea for such an interstellar trip started in the Alps, the Disneyland Alps. The first in the great dynasty of Disney mountains, the Matterhorn bobsleds arrived at Disneyland in 1959, providing the park with its first genuine thrill ride. The Matterhorn was pivotal in convincing Walt Disney that thrill rides would be a perfect fit for his park. Inspired by the space race that was unfolding at the time, he spoke to Imagineer John Hench about the idea of creating an indoor darkened roller coaster where guests would travel through the cosmos. The Tomorrowland project, known then as Space Voyage, would be worked on over the years by a rotating team of Imagineers, including Clem Hall, Herbert Ryman, and George McGinnis. At one point, the Imagineers wanted to have 4 separate intertwining tracks, but the technology at the time and Disneyland's limited real estate prevented that. Further complicating things was Walt's untimely passing in December of 1966, and the company's subsequent concentration on completing Disney World in Florida. Imagineering found themselves yet again taking another shot at the project when Walt Disney World opened in 1971, and ever so desperately needed an e-ticket attraction to accommodate the influx of crowds. Their first crack at solving that was the thought of erecting an eastern cousin of Disneyland's Matterhorn within the Magic Kingdom. The company, however, felt strongly that they did not want the Florida park to be an exact clone of Disneyland, and should instead feature its own unique attractions. This logic led Disney to focus on Tomorrowland, and the plans for the newly renamed Space Mountain were relaunched. Originally, the first location for Space Mountain would have been where the Carousel of Progress attraction stands today. But Imagineers wanted to take full advantage of the extra space of the Florida park and not be confined to existing borders. Thus, the attraction was built outside of the park's berm, with a tunnel traveling from the attraction's entrance beneath the Walt Disney World Railroad and connecting to the 180-foot tall and 300-foot wide domed show building. Space Mountain was designed as a dual-track coaster, featuring 2 separate but equally mirrored tracks. Imagineer Bill Watkins mathematically designed the coaster's steel tubular track to allow for the sharpest turns and highest banks possible. The cars were also given polyurethane wheels to help them glide faster. Despite this, and most surprisingly so, the attraction's top speed is only 27 miles per hour. The combination of sound effects, wind, and the disorientating cover of darkness worked to trick the rider's senses and sell the illusion of blasting through space. Space Mountain broke new ground when it opened on January 15, 1975, to great fanfare. It was the first roller coaster at Walt Disney World, the first to be controlled by a computer system, and the first to be completely enclosed. In the years that followed, Space Mountain would also go on to become the oldest operating roller coaster in the state of Florida. Fueled by the success in Florida, Disneyland Space Mountain was immediately greenlit. The only space left inside Disneyland's Tomorrowland was in the southern portion, but the location would mean that Space Mountain's iconic domed roof would tower behind Main Street's meticulously scaled period buildings. To solve this issue, Space Mountain's foundation was constructed several feet below ground level and then built upwards, just enough to conceal it from any observant eyes on Main Street. The small plot of backstage space in Tomorrowland, however, could only afford so much. The building was built smaller than its Florida counterpart, so only one track could fit in the Disneyland version. To make up for the loss of capacity, Imagineers redesigned the vehicles from a single-seater car to a two-seater car. At a cost of $18 million, more than what it took to build the whole park 22 years before, Space Mountain opened at Disneyland on May 27, 1977. Attendees included such dignitaries as the original Mercury astronauts and their families. A third Space Mountain, and an exact copy of Anaheim's, opened at Tokyo Disneyland on April 15, 1983. Disneyland Paris received its own uniquely themed Space Mountain on June 1, 1995. Space Mountain, from the Earth to the Moon, was radically different from the first three mountains. With three inversions, speeds of over 40 miles per hour, and a completely different source of inspiration driving the story, Space Mountain from the Earth to the Moon went on to forge its own path in Disney park history. Lastly, on September 12, 2005, Hong Kong Disneyland welcomed its own carbon copy of Space Mountain within its gates. Over the course of its decades-long history at Disneyland, Space Mountain has had a tumultuous history. In 1998, as part of the new Tomorrowland project, Disneyland Space Mountain was given a copper bronze hue, a retro-futuristic look meant to mimic the aesthetics of Paris's Discoveryland. The bizarre look lasted until 2003, when the attraction's exterior was returned to its classic white look. That same year, though, on April 10th, the attraction was abruptly closed because the roller coaster track had become unstable and required a complete replacement. On July 15, 2005, 2 days before Disneyland's 50th anniversary, Space Mountain reopened from its 2-year closure, with astronaut Neil Armstrong on hand to rededicate it. In addition to the rebuilt track, composer Michael Giacchino wrote a new musical score, replacing Dick Dale's surf guitar riffs that blared through the attraction since 1996. In 2007, Anaheim's reinvigorated Space Mountain was temporarily turned into Rockin' Space Mountain, an overlay inspired by the rock music-laden versions found during the park's Grad Night celebrations. That same year, Hong Kong Disneyland introduced Space Mountain Ghost Galaxy, a seasonal overlay that later made its way to Anaheim. Every Halloween season, Ghost Galaxy has guests traveling through the frightening reaches of the galaxy, an experience made even more terrifying as the close encounters are accompanied by chilling music and images. 2015 brought with it yet another change. To commemorate the release of Star Wars The Force Awakens, Space Mountain was transformed into Hyperspace Mountain, inspired by the faraway galaxy of Star Wars. The reimagined attraction remained in operation for nearly 2 years before becoming a periodic overlay of the classic Space Mountain attraction up until the present day. Space Mountain is widely billed as one of the most popular Disney attractions regardless of the park it presents itself in. Although each attraction has some sort of minor variation in it, the experience remains virtually the same amongst the Florida, Anaheim, Tokyo, and Hong Kong versions. The ride begins with guests boarding their rocket cars inside the space station. After a safety check, they are subsequently set up a small lift hill where the rocket cars enter the familiar flashing blue tunnel. After making a 180-degree turn in the tunnel, the cars ascend up the main lift hill. Once the riders reach the top, the rocket cars enter the dome section of the building where they undergo a series of sharp and sudden drops, turns, and lifts. The cover of darkness effectively limits the rider's ability to detect what will happen next, an effect that makes the experience an unpredictably memorable one. After the riders make their way through the series of swerving turns and dips, they escape through a red swirling wormhole before returning to unload. As an iconic and enthralling space adventure, Space Mountain, without a doubt, exists as the best definition of the phrase. Energetic in its premise and pulsating in its execution, Space Mountain is a timeless sensory experience that can easily be revisited again and again without ever losing its unique space-age charm.